July 23rd is the anniversary of the coup back in 1952 by Gamal Abdel Nasser and his colleagues that overthrew the Egyptian monarchy, prompting a bitter comment by ex-king Farouk that one day soon there will only be 5 kings: spades, hearts, diamonds, clubs, and England. He saw deeper than he realized, because the British monarchy had deep roots in a legitimate political culture that was conspicuously absent in Egypt and indeed in much of the world. In fact, Nasser's coup wasn't just about seizing power for himself and the colleagues he later deposed. It was about modernizing Egypt. It was about changing its political culture so that Egypt could keep up with, and this is almost always the punchline of these stories, the West. It seems like a forgotten world these days. Nasser himself seems almost as much a relic as, say, the King of Egypt, because he was of that generation of modernizing strongmen who were interested in the Soviet model and were secular. If we think about trouble in the Middle East these days, of course, we think about religious fanatics killing one another over who gets to kill us. But back then, this first wave had a very different flavor. People like Nasser, and this would include the Ba'ath Party that brought Saddam Hussein to power, even early Muammar Gaddafi, the Shah of Iran, and modernizers in other places like Singapore, who saw traditional religion as part of what made the Third World backward, made it unable to compete with the West militarily, economically, or culturally. These kinds of regimes were very much in vogue in the 1960s, but in virtually every important respect they failed. They didn't make their economies boom. In the Middle East, they kept losing wars with Israel. They produced shabbiness rather than inspiration in their political style. And eventually, a new wave, the Islamists, who first seized power in Tehran in 1979 and are now threatening to sweep across the Middle East, offer a radically different vision of how to fight the West. But notice that this theme, we must fight the West, we must find some way to compete with the dynamism of the West that doesn't involve becoming like the West. Because if you hate and fear Western influence, you're not willing to Westernize in order to fight it off. And each of them has proved to be not merely a failure, but a squalid failure. It's important to see how deep the roots of this go. In his big book, The Middle East, Bernard Lewis asks you to imagine a cafe patron somewhere in the Middle East and somewhere in Europe. And he says superficially they look a lot alike. They both look a lot different than their predecessors 50 or 100 years ago. But he says there's a critical difference. The changes in the European cafe are driven by developments internal to Europe. The changes in the Middle Eastern cafe are not. The guy sitting in the Middle Eastern cafe is listening to Western-style music on a sound system invented in the West. He's probably getting his water out of plumbing installed by Western imperialists. If he writes a pop song, I Hate Israel, he's using a Western genre. His world is determined by outside influences because no effective internal response has ever been found. And that's why you went from secular strongman socialist modernizers overthrowing the Austrian regime to Islamists overthrowing the secular strongman. To the extent that there are such things around in the world today, including in fact in Egypt, they're now on our side desperately trying to hold off the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, ISIL, or whatever it may be that is snarling and snapping at them. But they don't have an answer to their nation's backwardness, and neither does ISIL. Another important book on the subject, Theodor von Lauer's The World Revolution of Westernization, talks about how the terrifying dynamism of the West has overwhelmed the Third World. It's a thoughtful, reflective book. He even includes the Bolshevik Revolution as an example of this problem. But at the end of it, he says, the only thing to do is leave them alone. If we try to change them, that's just more outside influence. They really can't keep up with us. We just need to back off. But we can't, because we're not doing it to get in their face. We're doing it for our own reasons, and it spills over in ways that terrify them. Nasser, of course, like so many of these guys, Kwame Nkrumah and that crowd, turn into presidents for life, sordid with their rows of medals and their invented orders and their cheesy, oppressive tyranny. But it's a response to a very real problem to which no solution has ever been found, which is why the Egyptian monarchy is as dead as Marley's ghost and Canada's constitutional monarchy is still in full vigor.